A lot of people, I'm sure, will probably roll their eyes a little bit at the subject matter of this and the topic of this, but it's not me that's bringing it up. I probably would not have done a bigger deep dive into this had it not been for me hearing Pat Forde from Sports Illustrated on the College Football Inquirer podcast with Dan Wetzel and Ross Dellinger. You know, Dan Wetzel, congratulations, by the way, on getting hired back at ESPN. So, I mean, some of the biggest news breakers and most important personalities in the sport, these guys are all sitting around at a round table talking about this, and this is what Pat Forde brings up. He brings up Louisville and Pitt to the Big 12, okay? Louisville and Pitt to the Big 12. So let me share my screen with you, and we will hear from Pat. There we go. Make sure that I got it squared up. Okay, here's what Pat Forde has to say about Louisville and Pitt and the Big 12.
Beyond that, though, yeah, bad signals and further inequity. And I think, honestly, you know, you're going to have schools, I would imagine, that are, you know, on the shorter end of this stick. They're going to be looking at their options and saying, you know what? I'm Louisville. I'm Pittsburgh. How's Big 12 doing? Do we need to possibly look at going someplace else where we're going to get a better revenue shake? You know, I wouldn't say it's out of the question for schools that aren't just, you know, steeped in loyalty to the ACC and maybe feel like they have been handed a bad deal here. So I don't say they're going to get up and leave now, but you watch in 5 years and see what the possible exit plan.
So that is an important distinction. Why am I not back here? That is an important distinction that Pat Forde makes at the end there, which is like, hey, it's not like this is happening tomorrow. I don't think anybody, you know, Florida State fans might disagree with me. We'll see. I don't think anybody really has the appetite for $165 million like tomorrow to get out. I certainly don't think that the appetite would be there for that with a Louisville or a Pitt. I mean, he kind of mentions like, you know, maybe they'd be getting disenchanted with the idea of like, man, we're going to have to make whatever it might be, $10 million less a year than Florida State and Clemson. Like that doesn't seem really fair if you're Louisville. Like, man, we had a pretty good football season. We've had a solid football program here recently. We don't need to take that. Could we actually be making more money in the Big 12? But it's not going to be enough to make up, you know, the $165 million upfront cost on that, right? But you start planting the seeds for 5 years down the road when this comes up, because the dynamics have changed in the ACC with the addition of Stanford, Cal, and SMU to the point where they've got the strength in numbers that could theoretically keep them together as a conference if and when, probably more likely when, Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina at least decide to leave. But like there would be a scenario there. There would be a scenario there where you could say, all right, only 3 schools are going to leave. Maybe just the 3, only North Carolina, Florida State, and Clemson are coveted enough to actually get a spot where they would make a decent amount in the Big Ten or SEC. I say a decent amount because I'm still not completely convinced that would be a full share, but it would be enough that, you know, maybe they get the invite and take it. You could keep the rest of the conference together. There would be the numbers for that. But if by that time you've got places like Louisville, places like Pitt being like, man, we don't have the historical connections here that you guys do, so we don't really care so much about the history of this. And history is just being flushed down the drain actively every single day in this sport anyway. Plus, like, I don't know, you know, the Big 12 seems like it's dynamic, up and coming. Probably will have some sort of private capital infusion deal by that point. Looking around like maybe this is the way we need to do it. Like, this is our chance. This is when everything is changing. Let's make the jump. Let's make the jump and go do it, man. Why not? This could be something that pushes that further down the road. Whereas before, you know, I mean, I think when we were really talking about the Louisville Pitts of the world for a while in the Big 12, it was much more in this scenario of like, well, Florida State and Clemson they're pushing their way out one way or the other. And that's going to happen. Everything will tumble from that. That'll create a big, crazy eruption. Either grant of rights will be deemed basically nonsensical, nothing that's going to hold that together, and it'll just be a free for all, and everybody's going to leave. Or, before they had the extra 3 teams, Calford and SMU in there, like, oh, well, they won't have the numbers, and then it'll just totally dissolve anyway. That was the thought of how the Big 12 would wind up with some of the other ACC schools at that point. It has been a little bit more solidified. I mean, credit to the ACC. They have become a little bit more solidified in what they've done now. So there is a little bit more of a question, I think, as to what you would do if you are a Louisville or a Pitt in that sort of scenario. And Pat Forde has kind of pointed out there might be some seeds of dissent that have been planted. Some seeds of dissent that have been planted with all of this and how this is going to work, and how it evolves over the next 5 years too. Like, this is better, as I mentioned. It is better for these schools than being Oregon State and Washington State, but it does not mean that there's not going to be some unhappiness. It does not mean that there is not going to be some hurt feelings here from a lot of people and just getting annoyed. Like, ask the Big 12 that. Like, you don't need to tell anybody around here, the show originating from Big 12 country, about what that's like and how many hurt feelings there were about the Longhorn Network and Texas being able to make that extra money, Oklahoma making a little bit of extra money too with the 3rd-tier TV rights. Like, we know how that goes. And Florida State has already acted very brash about all this. I'm sure they have not made a lot of friends in the conference over the last 2 years throughout this whole saga. So, yeah, we shall see. Once again, wouldn't expect anything in the immediacy. I'm not trying to push anything like that. Like, there was that talk even for a little while. Hey, with private equity, could you lure Florida State or Clemson in almost immediately and use the private equity cash infusion to cover the exit fees and all that and make it happen and do that? You're not going to do that for, anybody other than Florida State and Clemson. And even then that might've still been a foolish idea. So that's not going to happen before a 5-year period, or maybe it's just if Florida State and Clemson do something crazy like that and everything there's some chaos scenario. But otherwise, you're looking at like 2030. But this did probably, I think start to plant some seeds for that. And it's not like Louisville and the Big 12, that's not going to be a totally new relationship. I mean, I know Brett Yormark was not around in 2011, but it's at least something that's been in Louisville's mind before, right? They've had this idea before when it was kind of Louisville and West Virginia duking it out for the last spot in the Big 12 after TCU had been added. After the last exodus of teams, or I guess the first exodus of teams from the Big 12 back around 2010, 2011. So that's already been close to happening. I was trying to look for the tweet today. Somebody out there has the tweet of like Louisville had some Big 12 signage made up at one point in time. Like that's how close it actually got. So this has been a flirtation before. Pitt would give you a natural rival with West Virginia. Obviously would love to have the backyard brawl in there. I'm sure Brett Yormark looks at Louisville basketball very favorably with what he wants to do for hoops. And 2030 again would be the time when you'd be trying to decouple the basketball rights to sell them separately. There are a lot of things that would make sense here. Obviously, the other part is, it has to sync up with a TV deal if you think they're going to be at worst a net neutral ad in terms of how much money each team in the league would get if you have them in your conference. But just keep this in the back of your mind, I guess, is really the idea here. Keep it in the back of your mind based on what we've seen here. And it's not some crazy Big 12 hypothetical scenario because we're getting this from Pat Forde, man. And I know there's a lot of you, he sucks, whatever. Kansas fans, I don't think are too fond of him because he's a Mizzou grad, but he's a respected guy that's been doing it for a long time, man. And I really like that podcast. So you got to listen to it. If you're a Josh Pate hater or a College Football Inquirer hater, you're going to have to hear me sing their praises from time to time.